Okay, so now it's time for one of our final topics. That's right, we're finally getting there towards the end of the pathology section. And this topic is amyloidosis. What is amyloid? Amyloid is essentially an accumulation of misfolded proteins that deposit in tissues throughout your body. What types of tissues? Oh, only the most important ones like your kidneys, your heart, your liver, and disrupt all of those. They even deposit in another organ that you can actually see on the outside and tell that someone has this disease. What is that organ? What is that physical exam finding? Macroglossia. So they even can deposit in the tongue. Wow. Okay, there's a stain that you can use to actually stain these types of proteins. It's very specific to them. What is that stain? It's the Congo red stain, which oddly enough turns the proteins green. I don't know why it's called Congo red. So it turns it into this apple green color that actually looks pretty. Check out these glomeruli in the kidney here in someone with amyloidosis. Even though it looks pretty, it's not a pretty disease. Let's talk about the major causes now of accumulating all these proteins. How can someone make so many misfolded proteins? Well, there's a number of causes. The first one we'll talk about is primary amyloidosis. So with this one, there is a primary cell that is synthesizing some proteins. So the problem is your body's cell actually primarily making too much protein. And in this case, it is a plasma cell. So what proteins do plasma cells make? Antibodies, right? Right. So that's fine when they normally do that. But when we have too many plasma cells making too many antibodies, that's a problem. And when do we see that? How about multiple myeloma, right? Right. And in multiple myeloma, sometimes these cells actually synthesize antibody fragments, not even the entire antibody. So just like the light chain, for example. And all these proteins accumulate and deposit in tissues and cause a lot of problems like we just discussed in the previous slide. So that's primary amyloidosis. Secondary is there's some stimulus for inflammation that causes it to last for a while. So chronic inflammation causing cells to release proteins that respond to the inflammation and deposit in tissues. So, what types of proteins, what types of cells? So let's say we have someone with lupus, and they're attacking their own red blood cells. Well, we know that this is going to activate a certain pathway. What? The complement cascade, right? Yeah, so inflammation will be triggered, and eventually we'll have a buildup of macrophages hanging around with all this inflammation occurring all the time. So macrophages then will release cytokines that lead to an increase in acute phase reactant proteins, such as what we discussed before, like fibrinogen, hepcidin, CRP. All these will start to accumulate throughout a person's body if they have inflammation taking place all the time for a long period of time. That's not good. And by the way, what cytokine do macrophages release to stimulate this chronic inflammation and the acute phase reactant production? It's interleukin 6. Very good. You guys are remembering stuff. So, that's secondary amyloidosis. The body is secondarily responding to the inflammation. The next type is dialysis-related. So this one we have to go back to immunology. So recall that every cell except for a certain cell possesses MHC1 receptors. What cells don't possess them? Red blood cells. Very good. So MHC1 receptors, and there's a fragment that actually transports antigens to that receptor. What fragment is that called? It's the beta-2 fragment. And in people who are on dialysis, they can filter their blood and filter out everything except for this large beta-2 fraction, which can then build up and cause problems, cause amyloidosis. The final example we'll talk about now is transthyretin. And what does this protein do? This is actually a transporter for thyroid hormones. In some people, there's a certain genetic mutation where they have too much transthyretin, an abnormal transthyretin. What is that gene called? They have an abnormality in the ATTR gene. And this most commonly targets the heart when it does accumulate. So no good. What are some other examples of localized amyloidosis that target more specific organs, like we just saw with transthyretin affecting the heart? So, what about the brain? What type of amyloidosis specifically builds up in the brain? How about Alzheimer's, right? Alzheimer's, and what is the name of that protein? It's amyloid precursor protein. And what chromosome is that synthesized from? Chromosome 21. So what population of people would you see this most commonly? People with Down syndrome, right? Why? Because they have 3 chromosome 21s. So they're going to synthesize much more of this amyloid precursor protein. Wow. All right, how about the thyroid? What cancer is associated with an increase in amyloid produced from the thyroid? Medullary carcinoma of the thyroid. And that produces what? Calcitonin. Calcitonin, a lot of it. And what does calcitonin do? I think of it as toning down the calcium. It will lower calcium. Okay, and final question is, what genetic syndromes will be associated with this type of cancer and this amyloid protein? The multiple endocrine neoplasia syndromes. And what specific types? 2A and 2B. You'll learn about those later. Final one is the pancreas. So, in people with diabetes, their glucose levels are out of control, right? Right. A protein that's synthesized from the pancreas to help increase the uptake of glucose from their blood vessels into the cells is a protein called amylin. And they're going to synthesize a lot of this because they're going to want to try to control their glucose. But just like it's appropriately named, this amylin can build up and cause amyloidosis. No good. So now it's time for lipofuscin, which is the last topic of our pathology section. So lipofuscin essentially is just the breakdown products of organelles within cells. Easy enough. So it's essentially the wear and tear pigment of cells. So here we have some mitochondria, and lysosomes, as you know, degrade things. They also degrade organelles even. When organelles are worn down and they're not functioning properly anymore, they get broken down and converted back into new mitochondria, some of the parts, and some of the parts are left around, like their phospholipid membranes. They can't be degraded fully, so they just hang around and actually accumulate within the cell as lipofuscin. So here we see actually some of the lipofuscin accumulated within cells. You can see it as a brown pigment. So that's essentially what it is, a brown wear and tear pigment, marker of old age. How old you are. If you're old, you're going to have more lipofuscin. If you're young, not quite as much. So that's the moral of the story. It doesn't hurt you, it just makes you look old.